Today, I am just going to run through some brief housekeeping for this technical session. So as mentioned, this session is being recorded and will be used as a resource for the horticulture industry. So yes, I forgot to mention at the very beginning, we are recording this session. Everybody should have had to consent to that. And with me, I also have members from the CFIA, or Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and Jade Reuser from the BCLNA is our tech support. So just to go through a few items, the Q&A period will be reserved for the end of the session. So currently, because this is a webinar event, attendees do not have access to a microphone or camera. This is to reduce interruptions to the program. So the questions can be submitted via the chat. So there's a chat icon. You can click on the chat icon or bubble, and questions will be answered in the order in which they will be received. We have Mary Rose from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency will be monitoring the chat and answering some questions for you. And then these questions will also be repeated at the end of the session during the Q&A so that they are captured in the recording. And once all questions have been answered from the chat, we will then take questions from the floor for those who wish to speak instead. You can use your raise hand icon, and a BCLNA staff member will unmute your microphone and ask you to present your question. You will then be muted and, unmuted and then muted again once your question's been answered. So we encourage questions and conversation during this period. Please don't be shy. And you can also change the layout of your screen if you're not if it's not working for you. So you can use the more icon and select various layouts through the gallery option, and you can kind of scroll through some of your different options there. So our speakers today from this session we have Jason Crandall and Thomas Somerville, program inspectors with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or the CFIA. Jason will be speaking to the beetle biology and background on the eradication program in Vancouver and throughout the Lower Mainland. And Thomas will then address movement controls and the options for retailers that were implemented just earlier this year. And we will then move on to our Q&A period. So quickly, a little bit about BCLNA for anyone here who's not a member or is not familiar. We are a nonprofit industry organization of more than 450 members. We represent the nursery, landscape, and retail sector within BC. We also work with provide education, suppliers, services, and government organizations. And we all promote the global recognition of British Columbia as a leader in landscape horticulture. We provide an effective organization for meeting the needs of nursery growers, landscape professionals, and garden centers. So for more information on our association, please visit bclna.com. And a bit of what we do. So we progressively engage relevant issues to the benefit of the industry. We promote high standards of horticulture practices within the province of BC. We provision skilled services to the public by members of the association. We educate on the relevance of horticulture in fostering the healthy stewardship and beautification of urban and rural environments. And if you're interested in BCLNA membership or would like more information, please contact us at info@bclna.com, or you can reach out to us in the chat as well. Our Japanese Beetle team at BCLNA, currently myself, the technical coordinator. I work with mostly the landscapers on this program, but of course communications and working on guidelines with our growers and the rest of industry that is involved. And we have Jade Reuser, our marketing and communications coordinator for all of our Japanese Beetle communications, and Virpi Kangas, our chief operating officer. So this program has been a collaborative effort between many stakeholders and agencies. There are many organizations that have been involved in the eradication program, making this work possible. This collaboration with multiple levels of government, industry organizations, and stakeholders is a unique response strategy. This is the first time this type of partnership has been used to address the eradication of a pest in Canada, and has gained a lot of interest from other groups to use as an example for future programs. If you'd like more information on Japanese Beetle or want to stay informed on critical updates and changes to the program, you can subscribe to our weekly Japanese Beetle update. You can email us at info@bclna.com to subscribe, or you can visit the webpage on our website to sign up. I did put a link in the welcome message in our chat. We also have Japanese Beetle web pages specifically for both the retail industry and the landscape industry as well. I also added those links to the welcome message. There will also be lots of information on Japanese Beetle at our annual horticulture trade show next week. We have Grow West Coast in Surrey at the Civic Plaza, September 14th and 15th. CFIA, the Invasive Species Council, and the Ministry of Food and Agriculture will have booths as our bug zone. So you can sign up at growwestcoast.com, and we will add a link to that in the chat as well. And lastly, we would just like to acknowledge funding for this program from the Canadian Agriculture Partnership, or CAP program, and the BC Ministry of Agriculture and Food. So thank you, everyone. I will now be turning it over to CFIA to present. And again, if you have questions, we welcome them in the chat. And we will be monitoring that throughout the webinar. And I now pass it over to Jason Crandall with the CFIA.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason, and I'm a regional program officer for the Japanese Beetle program. I'm based out of the Abbotsford office. And I'm just going to share my screen here and we'll get started. Okay. So we're going to talk about Japanese Beetle today. And I'm going to be doing the first half of the presentation where we're going to go over some biology, some distribution, the surveillance program, a little bit of historical information about what we've done so far. And then I'm going to pass the reins over to Thomas, who's going to talk to you about some of the more regulatory stuff, movement restrictions for plant material and soil, and how that might pertain to you. So, Japanese beetle. It is a regulated and quarantined pest in Canada and the United States. It is not native. It's native to the main islands of Japan and was first introduced in 1916 in New Jersey. And it's pretty widespread throughout eastern North America. You can see the map there. Shows you a distribution from iNaturalist. And if you notice on the top far left corner, there's a little red square there, and that's us. And that's what we're going to focus on. So broadly, if you look in our directive for Japanese beetle, which we can link you to in the chat, we have regulatory status for each individual province and state. And those indicate what level of infestation, if any, or not at all, and kind of help us regulate and keep track of domestic movement, as well as exports to the United States, and what kind of measures and risk prevention that we need to take for material moving between those different categories. So the dark green, that's where it's kind of generally infested or partially infested. We know it's on the East Coast. We know it's in those areas. Then we've got the light green where, you know, it's there, but sort of kind of lower numbers. And then the orange is pest-free. And British Columbia is the only Canadian province that has that pest-free status. And we are working towards keeping it that way through this eradication program. So the picture you're looking at here is the current regulated areas in the Lower Mainland. We have one for Vancouver and we have one for Burnaby. It didn't always look like this. So every year, regardless of whether or not Japanese beetle was here, we always did an annual survey for Japanese beetle, and we set out traps throughout the entire Lower Mainland at a pretty low distribution. And we used that to maintain that pest-free status that I just talked about. Now in 2017, Japanese beetle was first detected near False Creek as part of that survey. We intensified the number of traps around that find to delimit the extent of the population, if any. And we found that there was quite a sizable population around False Creek, sort of centered in Davidland Park. Really, that was the epicenter at the time. So the following year, as a result, in 2018, we created a regulated area in Vancouver, which was smaller than the one we're looking at now. And those boundaries allow us, through a ministerial order, to restrict the movement of plant material and soil during certain times of year, to help mitigate the spread and the risk of Japanese beetle. Now, in 2021, we detected a number of beetles outside of those boundaries. And as a result, in Vancouver, Burnaby, and Pocatello. And as a result, we had to expand the regulated area. We expanded the Vancouver regulated area in 2022, and we created a regulated area in Burnaby. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of what we're looking at here. Here we have the two kind of main life stages of Japanese beetle, although there's a pupal stage as well, of course. On the left, you have the larvae. It's about 1 inch long, roughly, when it's mature. Goes through a couple of different incells or molts. It has an off-white color. It's C-shaped. That's pretty typical of scarab beetle larva. It looks very similar to chafer beetle, although it's a little smaller. It would be hard to identify them in the field. 3 pairs of legs, just like any insect. And then it pupates and transforms into the adult, which is about 10 millimeters long. I would say slightly smaller than a chafer beetle, roughly the same size. They're a little bit more oval shaped. I'll show you an example in a minute. Key characteristics, you've got the bronzy brown elytra, or the outer ring shell. It's generally kind of metallic green, and it's got 6 tufts of white hair on each side, which we'll look at a little closer in a minute. Here it is compared to European chafer. So again, very, very similar. European chafer is a little bigger, but when you're in the field, I think it's a very difficult field, I think. But you know, similar body plan, similar kind of damage. Here it is compared to a couple of other scarab beetles. We've got the 10-line June beetle, the big guy there. That's our native scarab beetle, and then in the middle there's the European brown chafer, and then the Japanese beetle. And you can see the chafer and the Japanese beetle are roughly the same size. The chafer is a little bit more oblong. It's a little bit longer, whereas the Japanese beetle is a bit more oval shaped. So that key diagnostic feature, like I mentioned earlier, is that 6 tufts of white hair along each edge of the abdomen. There's 12 total. Chafer doesn't have that. The 10-line June beetle doesn't have that. It's pretty distinctive, and really makes Japanese beetle stand out from the other one. Here's all the different stages laid out nicely in a line, going from egg to adult. And as you can see, the larval stage goes through a number of molts. We call that incel. I really like this graphic here. We're going to spend a bit of time on this one. I think it was created by someone in Oregon. Quote me on that though. But so we're going to start on the right side of the diagram with that beetle right above the month of July and August. It's going down into the ground. And it's going to lay eggs kind of August through September, roughly. An adult beetle can lay as many as 60 eggs at a time. And it's going to just go below the surface of the soil, maybe 5 centimeters deep. It's going to deposit those eggs, and they're going to hatch in the fall. And you're going to see the first couple of larval lythoceras kind of move through the fall and feed on the turf roots. Right into the root zone there. They're going to feed on the turf roots. As the weather gets colder through the winter, those larvae are going to move their way deeper into the soil, about, it could be as deep as 31 centimeters. And that's where they're going to spend the winter. It's a little warmer, and they're going to enter into something called diapause, which is like a hibernatory state where they kind of just hang out, sleep away the winter, wait for the warmer weather. Once the spring starts to come, now we're on the left side of the diagram, March, April, February, maybe even, those larvae start to move back up from the depths and back into the root zone, and they start to feed on the roots again and do the final bit of feeding and putting on weight until they pupate around May and then emerge roughly June 15th is kind of the beginning of our adult beetle flight window in Vancouver. This is also really good because it's a great way to illustrate why treatments are timed the way they are. Those treatments need to be targeted for the times of year when those larvae are not deep within the soil, but rather up and feeding. So they need to ingest that pesticide. So why is it regulated? Well, it's a pretty damaging pest. Like chafer, the larvae feed on the roots. We've all seen this before, those brown patches of grass. You roll it back, little white grubs. Crows love them, raccoons love them. We've all seen it before. JB does much the same. Here it is again, same idea. Wide variety of plant roots though, not necessarily always grass. You could possibly find larvae, around shrubs or garden crops, but turf is the preferred host for oviposition or egg laying, and that's where you're going to find most of the larvae. Unlike chafer, though, JB is distinctive because the adults are also voracious feeders. They're what we call skeletonizers. They eat that delicious chlorophyll-rich tissue between the veins of the leaf. They just leave a skeleton behind, and as you can see, it's quite damaging. Here's some more damage here. You could see how that would, impact ornamental horticulture. It could impact production, agriculture, pretty damaging. They also feed on flower buds and fruit. So again, major risk to agriculture here, but here it is on a rose, ornamental horticulture as well as very much at risk. Roses are a preferred host. A little bit more pictures of feeding. More feeding here. Yes, they do attack adult full-size trees. Typically, we see that they start at the top of the tree and kind of feed their way down, which kind of actually helps inform our survey a little bit. We do put traps up from the top of the tree, and we find them to be quite effective in catching beetles. Here's a picture of Persicaria. That's another preferred host. You see that a lot in those Glen parts. Those are one of the beetles. Japanese beetle is a very sun-loving, so it's very much the most active when the weather is nice, when the sun is out, when it's warm, above 21 degrees. They're going to be flying around the beetle. Again, very voracious feeder. Over 300 plant species have been known to be a food source to Japanese beetle. Feeds anything from ornamentals to tree fruit to field crops. And again, Persicaria here in David Glen Park, the preferred host. Some other favorites, I mentioned roses as well, but a lot of stuff you see quite frequently around here, Japanese maple, other kinds of maples, grapevines, elderberries, prunus malus, you name it, they'll feed on it. Got it all here. So, potential consequences. Obviously, there's an incredible potential here for damage to agricultural sectors and horticultural sectors. That's going to lead to an increased cost of to the industry, the retail industry. There's going to be losses. There's going to be control measures potentially. that you need to undertake. That's going to be costly. And that loss of pest-free status, and that's going to be quite impactful as well. The things that are moving across the border in particular, there's going to, if that happens, there'll be a requirement to set up and maintain certification programs, much in the same way they have in Ontario. And there's more information on those in the directive. We aren't quite there yet, though. We're hopefully going to try to avoid that as much as.
Jason, I'm just going to pop in for a second. Can you just speak up a little bit?
Yeah, for sure.
Great, thank you.
So speaking of costs, here's an estimate that was done. I think 2015 is what it says. 28.1 million annually. Now that includes, a number of high-profile crops throughout different industries. That's going to include the cost of damage and loss of production, as well as cost of control for Japanese beetle if it was established here. So we're really trying to avoid that. So the survey, that's a really important part of what we're doing. I mentioned earlier that we always do a survey. We had been doing surveys for Japanese beetle years before we found it. We set out traps throughout the entire lower mainland. The survey officially runs from June 10th to October 15th, which lines up with the adult beetle flight period. But we need to get those traps out by June 10th. So we start placing them as early as April. Typically, traps are checked about every 3 weeks, but we do trap a bit more extensively in what we would consider high-risk sites. And they're checked once a week. That would include like David Line Park, areas where we've caught beetles before. And we have some other criteria for high-risk sites that I have on the slide coming up. So here's the traps. They contain a dual lure. There's a pheromone, and then there's a floral kind of feeding cue scent that we use in conjunction together. It's pretty effective. And below, we have a number of different types of traps lined up nicely in a row there. They essentially do all the same things, despite being slightly different. They're just different designs. They have fins at the top where the lure is attached. The beetle flies and crashes into those fins, folds up its wings, drops into the funnel and down into the collection cup. They can be different colors. They can have different sizes of collection cups. Typically, we use the ones with the small collection cup in the middle there for up in the canopy of trees. But we place traps all over the place, at ground level, on rooftops, anywhere we can, really. So high-risk sites and site selection, we're really looking to think about where might there be places that have a higher risk of introduction. Places like nurseries and plant retailers, golf courses, public parks and gardens, airports, border crossings, places that accept soil. So anywhere that takes yard waste, like transfer sites and things like that. Or anywhere that it could do a little bit of hitchhiking, so like rail terminals, for example. Japanese Beetle is a pretty well-known hitchhiker, so we kind of try to think about that as well. And we place extra traps there. We check them more frequently, and hopefully find nothing. So here's the survey data so far. This is a nice graph. We've got in blue the total number of traps that were put out every year since 2017. And as you can see, it has increased every year, and that's true again for 2022. The red line that follows those blue bars is the number of beetles that were detected during the survey. You can see that since 2018, we have seen declines in the population, which is good news. And in the green there is the number of traps where Japanese beetle was found in. So, for example, in 2018, which was our biggest population year, we found 8,274 beetles in 98 traps, over 2,088 traps. But mostly, so far, it's a success. Population's been declining, and that's exactly what we want to see. So there's David Lamb Park. That's been so far the epicenter of the Japanese beetle infestation in the mainland. Most of our beetles in previous years have been caught here. For example, in 2020, 81% of the beetles that we found that year were found just in David Lamb Park, right where that red star is. Here's a little peek at the survey from last year. Pink circles represent traps. Pretty dense, but zoomed out, that shows the interior and the island as well. You can see how extensively we trap the lower mainland and the Fraser area. Here's a more zoomed in map showing the detections for 2021. As you can see, the pink traps again, or pink circles again, represent traps. Red squares are positive locations. Now, that looks, pretty extensive. Again, David Lamb Park, False Creek, but we saw, as you'll see in the coming slides, we saw a little bit more movement of Japanese beetle here. Finds in Burnaby and Fort as well. But still a reduction despite a little bit more of a spread. We still saw 65% less beetles from the year previous. So here's those detections in Vancouver in relation to the regulated area. And you can see what I'm talking about in that we created those boundaries based on the survey results previously. And that's where we expect most of our beetles. But in 2021, we found more beetles outside the regulated area than inside the regulated area. And that is what led to the expansion of those boundaries. Again, same thing in Burnaby and Fort Coquitlam, more beetles outside of a regulated area than inside of a regulated area. And that is why a regulated area is bigger than Burnaby. So, can't say this enough, the population was declining despite seeing more beetles outside of those boundaries. It was a little puzzling. 63% of all of the beetles were outside of the regulated area. But that's what the survey is for. It informs our decision making, and for 2022, we expanded those boundaries and put controls on those areas as well. And then just an even broader look at the survey in the lower mainland and Fraser Valley. The trap distribution is not uniform. We've trapped more densely around Vancouver, and that density decreases as we go out into the valley, where we believe the risk of finding a beetle at this point in time is lower. So these numbers represent traps per square mile. So out in the Fraser Valley, Abbotsford, etc., it's half a trap per square mile, 1 trap per square mile, moving inwards 9, and then 49 around where we know beetles are, to be certain. So that's my half, and I am going to pass it off to my colleague Thomas, who will tell you all about how we're controlling that and what those regulated areas mean for you.
Thank you very much, Jason. As Jason mentioned, my name's Thomas. I am a multi-program inspector, specifically with the Japanese Beetle program with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, based out of our Burnaby office. I'm going to be going through more about the Japanese beetle movement controls. I'm going to first give a little bit of a broad overview of what the controls look like for multiple industries, and then I am going to go with a deeper dive on specifically what it means for retailers, what the impact is from a retailer perspective. As Jason mentioned earlier, the movement controls are established under the Plant Protection Act and a ministerial order. And we expanded our regulated area in 2022 in reaction to the increase in detections outside of the previous regulated area. Jason, if I could get you to pop over to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we amended the Japanese Beetle ministerial order to increase the boundaries of that area within the city of Vancouver. Basically, what that means is there is now a larger area in which these regulations apply. We also created a new regulated area within the city of Burnaby. What this means is that regulated materials, which I will talk about in a little bit, are only allowed to move freely within those regulated areas. And in order to move regulated materials outside of the regulated areas, you require permissions from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, which comes in the form of a movement certificate. This allows us to prevent the unintentional human-assisted spread of Japanese beetles into pest-free and unregulated areas. On the next slide, you will find a map that Jason has showed you before with the current regulated areas for the 2022 year. This is available on our website as well interactively, that you can put in an address and you'll be able to find whether or not you are inside of the regulated area. In specific context for retailers, your customers could also potentially use this map to find whether or not their street address or their postal code is inside of the regulated area. That next slide there is a zoomed in version of the Vancouver regulated area. I'm not going to go street by street to tell you where the regulated area is, but it's bounded in the east approximately by Knight Street and Clark Drive, in the south by West 49th, East 49th as well, jogs around a little bit in the western part of South Vancouver, and then follows the high water mark of False Creek, Stanley Park, and the southern side of the Burrard Inlet before coming back to Clark Drive. These regulated areas, as Jason mentioned, are reevaluated annually. We have made changes in the past, like he mentioned, to those regulated areas. We saw a change, rather significant one, in 2022, and it is possible that you see changes to those regulated areas again. If there are changes made, that information will be made available to regulated partners as well as industry that may be impacted as soon as we have that information available. The next slide there, again, is just a zoomed in version of that regulated area in Burnaby. Smaller in terms of area than the Vancouver regulated area, but both areas are rather diverse in that they contain residential areas, industrial areas, parks and green spaces as well. So it is, it can be a challenge to regulate, and we are glad to have your assistance in that regard. So the following slide will talk a little bit about how movement controls and movement restrictions work in simple terms. Basically, you can move anything into a regulated area. We're not concerned, say, moving something from Delta into the Vancouver regulated area because it is moving something that is from a pest-free area or an area where we haven't found Japanese beetle into an area where we have found Japanese beetle. Movement within a regulated area is permitted without certificate as well, because again, it is moving from an area in which we have found Japanese beetle and it is staying within that area. The movement that is regulated or restricted is movement out of a regulated area. So say, for instance, moving a product from within the Vancouver regulated area to an address in Vancouver outside of the regulated area, or movement from within the Burnaby regulated area to outside of the Burnaby regulated area. As this applies to retailers, it's particularly relevant for your customers who are moving plants that you may have sold outside of the regulated area. Also relevant for, say, landscapers or construction companies, excavators, who may be moving regulated material off of site to a waste site, which we do talk a little bit about in the next slide, getting into the regulated articles, regulated materials, and what they are. So regulated articles include soil of any depth. This one is because it is a high risk of potentially hosting Japanese beetles, and that is the crux of what all of the regulated materials are. Regulated articles are things that are potentially infested or likely to be infested with Japanese beetles when they originate in that regulated area. And they also include things that may be a pathway for movement for those Japanese beetle eggs, larvae, pupae, or adults. So as Jason mentioned, you'll find those Japanese beetle larvae and eggs in that top 30 centimeters of soil, depending on exactly when it is in the year, which is why soil of any depth is regulated year-round, although there are specific restrictions that apply to those top 30 centimeters versus soil that comes from deeper. Plants with soil as well are regulated year-round because they may as well play host to Japanese beetle pupae, larvae, or eggs. And plants and above ground plant parts that are substantially free from soil are only regulated during that Japanese beetle flight period, which in Vancouver is June 15th to October 15th. Those are regulated as they may be a risk to carry the adult Japanese beetle out. As Jason mentioned, Japanese beetles are well known as hitchhikers that may be moved unintentionally by human activities, moving products outside of the regulated area. So how do you move those things outside of the regulated area? Well, a movement certificate issued by the CFIA is required to move regulated materials out of the regulated area. There are as well exempted articles that we will talk about a little bit here. These include things that are unlikely to carry or be infested with live Japanese beetle, eggs, larvae, pupae, or adults, and they can move freely without the need of a movement certificate. This includes things like gravel, aggregates, rocks, asphalt, and silt, provided they are substantially free from soil. Substantially free from soil is a term that we will use quite frequently with this program. Basically, what that means is that it has been washed or shaken clean of soil so that no individual soil clump remains on the material that is larger than ½ an inch or 12.7 millimeters. So quite small amounts of soil are able to transit, but substantially free from soil is the standard that we are looking for. Branches, sticks, trunks, and wood with no leaves attached that are substantially free from soil, as well as these are not deemed to be a high-risk material for the transit of Japanese beetle. Potted houseplants that have been grown indoors within a regulated area and have not been placed outdoors. For instance, if you have a plant that's been sitting on your kitchen counter inside of the regulated area, but has only been outside, it would be an exempted material. But if it has been out on your apartment patio, for instance, then it would require a movement certificate to leave that regulated area. Below ground plant and root systems that are substantially free from soil, as well as green plant waste that is chipped or ground in a horizontal grinder and is substantially free from soil. This could also include things like roots, bulbs, tubers, things of that nature. And on cut flowers and decorative branches, which were produced outside of a regulated area and sold at a florist shop within the regulated area, those would be exempt as well. Fresh fruit and vegetables for consumption. Commercially packaged media. So for instance, if you're looking at things like soil or peat that have been commercially prepared and sealed and sold at a store within the regulated area, those would be exempted as well. And articles in transit through the regulated area are exempt as well. So say, for instance, you're moving something from North Vancouver down to Richmond, as you would transit directly through the center of that regulated area. There's no need to apply for a movement for that or to go around the regulated area as long as you are not stopping. As Jason mentioned, that pest-free window that flight period window in Vancouver is June 15th to October 15th, which means that the Japanese beetle pest-free window would be January 1st to June 14th, and then October 16th to December 31st of the same year, which basically means that the adults are not present and are not at risk to be hitchhiked out of the regulated area by human activities, and they are not actively laying eggs, which informs a lot of our decisions when it comes to exactly what is regulated. Some articles, for instance, are only exempted during the pest-free window when Japanese beetles are not present, which we'll talk about on the next slide here. All plants and above ground parts that are substantially free from soil are exempted during the pest-free window. Potted plants, including ornamental grasses and nursery stock, provided that it entered on or after October 16th and then leaves on or before June 14th of the consecutive year. So what that means essentially for a retailer would be if they're bringing in stock from a nursery in November and selling it in May, then it would be exempted from the movement regulations because it has not been inside of the Japanese beetle area during a period that is high risk because the beetles are not flighted through the winter months and into the early spring. Like we said, June 15th is approximately the emergence time in Vancouver. Also, if plants are kept exclusively indoors during the regulated Japanese beetle flight period, they are exempt as well. And we do also want to work with you to consider other exemptions on case-by-case basis based on your needs and your unique situation as retailers working within the Japanese beetle regulated area. So what can you as retailers do to help keep British Columbia Japanese beetle free and maintain that pest-free status that we have? In order to reduce the risk of spreading beetles to outside of the regulated area, we have recently updated our guidance documents to include a section specifically for retailers, which outlines 4 options for retailers who are located within the regulated area and wish to sell plotted plants with soil and groil media to be taken outside of the regulated area. I'm going to give you an overview of what that looks like over these next few slides. But again, these are things that will be considered case-by-case basis, and we recognize that not every situation is identical. In fact, almost every situation is going to be unique. So we are going to, again, at the end, have a question period where you can ask specific questions about this. And also, we encourage dialogue back and forth outside of these presentations as well. If you want to get in touch with the CFIA for questions specifically about this, we highly encourage it. So the primary option that you can see there is to keep the plants indoors. If the retail plants are kept exclusively indoors in a closed indoor space during the Japanese beetle flight period from, as we mentioned, June 15th to October 15th, they can be moved outside of a regulated area with no movement certificate required. This is the simplest option in a lot of cases. If the plants are kept in a closed indoor area, which by definition is a building where all of the space between floor and ceiling is enclosed by windows and doors, and the windows and doors are generally kept closed, then there is no need for a movement certificate. We ask that you do inform us if you are a retailer and this is your situation so that we confirm that, in fact, yes, you do meet these requirements. But this covers a lot of cases for retailers who are keeping their plants indoors. The second option is what we call regulatory treatment. This is a specific regulatory treatment based on Section 5.3 of our directive and our ministerial order for Japanese beetles. It also requires the issuance of a movement certificate after the treatment has occurred, and it would be for multiple movements to various clients of unspecified destination. This is an option that is available. However, option 2 and the option I'm going to speak about shortly, option 3, are ones that we view as likely ones that will be rather niche cases. If there is a situation where it does come up that this is the best option, of course, it will be one that is available and that you can take. But there are several different restrictions that are placed on this. For instance, regulatory treatment involves having a root ball that is of a certain rather specific size and that it be treated in a specific way. Again, it is an option that is available, but it and option 3, which I'll talk about now, are ones that are generally not, at least in our experience and our opinion, going to be ones that are taken by the majority of retailers. Option 3 is our greenhouse and screenhouse program. If the retailer plants were produced with in compliance with the pest-free greenhouse and screenhouse program, and a movement certificate has been issued by the retailer, then the plants can be moved outside of the regulated area. These require specific actions to develop a Japanese beetle management plan and specific instructions on the construction and maintenance of the greenhouse or screenhouse, as well as specific instructions related to the soil and plant materials that are being produced and kept within the greenhouse and screenhouse. Again, this is an option that is available. However, it is one that, unless you are a nursery that is already enrolled in this program, is not necessarily one that we foresee using a lot. But again, if it is the best option for you, we will certainly do everything in our power to make it work. But the fourth option is the one that we suspect, in conjunction with option 1, which is the indoor plants, will cover roughly 98% of cases. And that's what we call a regulatory notice. So that means is if the plant entered the regulated area after October 16th of the previous year and is not a grass, so not of family Poaceae, it can be sold and moved by a customer outside of the regulated area under specific conditions. And the conditions that have to be met are those that need to be met by the retailer, at which point we will issue a movement certificate for multiple addresses and unspecified destinations, multiple movements, to ensure that you are able to sell those plants to your customers. So on the next slide, you'll see the regulatory notice that CFIA would issue you. It essentially requires you to display CFIA-issued signage, which we would be providing to you. Inspect a plant for Japanese beetle when that plant leaves your store with a customer. So basically what that means is having your staff look at the plant and see if there is a Japanese beetle physically sitting on that plant, and allow the CFIA to place a trap for Japanese beetles within your business during the flighted season, which is June 15th through October 15th. That would be done by an inspector, perhaps myself, perhaps one of our other inspectors, and allow us access to that trap so that we can check it throughout the years and maintain it. We like this option because it allows us to expand our surveillance grid as well to areas that do have a lot of plants in them, like retailers, and get even more data to be able to determine where the Japanese beetles are and if they are present. Once we have confirmed that you are compliant with the regulatory notice requirements I talked about just a second ago, we will issue you a movement certificate. And as I mentioned before, that movement certificate will be a blanket movement certificate for the entirety of the regulated period, which would allow you to move those plants to any customer who was purchasing them and taking them outside of the regulated area. So with this, there do come certain expectations. The expectations that we will provide you with a sign that you will display. That sign is going to be issued by us. We'll provide you with a physical copy when we inspect your store to ensure that you're compliant, but we will also provide you with PDF copies that you can print as many as you need. We're also not expecting that you inspect every single plant in your store. However, what we do ask that you do is ask every customer whether or not they will be taking the plant outside of the regulated area. If they indicate that they are, then the plant should be inspected for signs of Japanese beetle. That could mean a physical beetle sitting on the plant. That could also mean the skeletonization that we showed in some previous slides. We also have plenty of resources available online if you are looking for more examples of what Japanese beetle feeding or signs and symptoms may look like. If a beetle is found or suspected, we also ask that you get in touch with the CFIA immediately via our phone number. That's 604-292-5742, and we will dispatch an inspector to follow up. And if you do see those Japanese beetles on a plant, we ask that you do not allow that plant to leave the regulated area until that inspector has come and seen what is going on. The family Poaceae, the grasses that we talked about, should not be allowed to leave the regulated area, as they are, like Jason mentioned earlier, the preferred host for Japanese beetle. So you should discuss other options with your customers for moving grasses or taking grasses from areas within the regulated area to other areas within the regulated area. Grasses, as we mentioned before, are a significant risk for Japanese beetle because they are both a food source and an ideal place where Japanese beetle females may lay their eggs. This family Poaceae is rather large. It includes grasses such as Kentucky bluegrass, ryegrass, fescue, and bentgrass. They can be sold whenever you'd like to and moved within the regulated area. But again, we ask that they do not be moved outside of the regulated area. We also ask, to follow up a little bit on what I was talking about earlier, if you do find a Japanese beetle or a suspect Japanese beetle, that you capture it and take photos of it, place it in a hard-sided container, something that will be able to keep it so that the inspector can come and look at it, or that you can send photos to us of it. And we encourage erring on the side of caution. Japanese beetle is a rather distinctive looking pest that makes it fairly easy to identify for us, which is fortunate. But if you do see something and you're not sure whether it is a Japanese beetle or whether it's chafer or a line June beetle or something else, we really do encourage you to contact us as soon as possible. We would much rather receive reports of Japanese beetle that turn out to be chafer beetle than miss a report of something that is in fact Japanese beetle. So looking at how you would go about choosing an option, you would first internally assess which option is or which option you think works the best for us, or for you, excuse me. Inform us via email of which option you are going to be preferring to take, and then we will work with you to try and find an option that satisfies what you are looking for and also satisfies what we as a regulator are looking for. And again, we recognize that operations may have unique circumstances. In fact, operations are likely going to have unique circumstances across the board. So we are flexible working with you because we do want to encourage compliance. You can get a movement certificate and you can get in touch with us in general by going to inspection.canada.ca/JB and finding our movement certificate application form. It's a 2-page PDF. It does not take too long to fill out, which is fortunate. And then email it to our Japanese Beetle address. Links for all of this stuff will be in the chat as well for your convenience. And if you do have questions for us after this presentation is concluded, or you want to talk more about the guidelines for retailers, we encourage you as well to send us an email at that Japanese Beetle email account. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about compliance and potential enforcement actions. We continue to conduct outreach like this program right now to educate and notify organizations and people in our community about the potential risk that Japanese beetle poses. In the event that we do have non-compliances, we will provide the regulated party with the opportunity to regain compliance. However, when there are issues observed, we do have regulatory options that can include fines or notices of violation. But ultimately, we are looking to keep everyone in compliance with your assistance as members of industry who could potentially be impacted by this. And again, we do really appreciate your assistance in that endeavor, and we are looking to ensure, with your help, that this pest can be eradicated in British Columbia and that we are able to maintain that pest-free status. What else can you do? The big thing that we want is that you are reporting all suspect Japanese beetles. Like I mentioned, err on the side of caution when it comes to getting in touch with us if you think you've seen a Japanese beetle. Spreading the word. As members of industry, you are often leaders for people, and people come to you with plant and pest related questions. So we encourage you to do outreach or encourage people to get in contact with the CFIA so that they can learn more. And we want to promote awareness that the beetle is in British Columbia and that there is an effort to eradicate the beetle in British Columbia. I'd like to thank you again for your assistance in this endeavor. And I believe I'm going to pass you back to Fanny for our question period.
Great, thank you, Thomas. That was excellent. And Jason, very in-depth information. Yes, so we'll go to our question and answer period. I know we're running near the end of our webinar. We can go over a few minutes. For those of you who do have to leave right away, please feel free to pop a question in the chat. We will answer it so that it is captured in the recording, or you can also email us at info@bclna.com and we will get your questions answered. First, I'll just address one of the questions that came up in the chat during the presentation is that, containment measures have been ineffective after an early opportunity in 2007 to annihilate the beetle in the limited area in downtown Vancouver. Now it's spreading throughout Vancouver. What is going to change going forward to control and remove the threat of this invasive species? Mary Rose from CFIA did answer this question, so I will read her response. She noted that based on surveillance data collected since treatment began in the city of Vancouver in 2018, treatment has proven to be an integral part of the response and effective in significantly reducing the number of Japanese beetles. There are over 8,000 beetles detected in the original regulated area, and last year less than 50 were found in that same area. So while mandatory measures such as movement certificates are applicable to locations within the regulated area, there are also best practices and biosecurity measures that can be used to prevent the spread of any emerging beetle populations in other communities. In addition to regulatory controls, members of the Japanese beetle response continue to focus on education and outreach to the public and industry members who all play a role in preventing the spread of this pest. I also just will add that the Japanese beetle partnership, at the end of the surveillance period, when we can see where all of the beetles have been found and the number of detections, we then review all of the movement controls and the everything that's been implemented for the following year. It's all reviewed and we make an action plan for the following year. So just wanted to add that when moving forward, we always try to look ahead and assess what information we have from the current year. Any additional questions, you're welcome to raise your hand and we will unmute you if you would like. I see a question might be coming in. Another question here, why are the box stores not being forced to comply with the regulations? Jason or Thomas, go ahead.
Well, I just want to start by kind of echoing what you had said in that, just with regards to the previous question, that, these measures are reviewed every year. The survey data is incredibly important to what we're doing, and we make sure that the control measures that we're placing are appropriate to the population. So, in terms of spread, that's why you saw an expanded regulated area and a lot more densification in terms of trap numbers. Now, despite the fact that it's spread out a little bit, it's very important to remember that this eradication program has been a success. The numbers have decreased dramatically, and beetles moving does not necessarily mean more beetles. So it's important not to confuse those. Japanese beetle is an extremely adept hitchhiker. So even a small population could easily, jump on a car or something. It's easy for it to move around, but treatments have been effective. The movement controls have been largely effective. And I think we would be in a much worse situation if those controls were not in place. So sorry, the second question there, why are the box stores not being forced to comply with the regulations? Well, forced is a pretty strong word, but as retailers, they're subject to the same regulations anyone else might be. So, Thomas really did a good job of touching on this, and that we always ask for cooperation and voluntary compliance first. And because these restrictions for retailers are relatively new, and these are things that we're kind of bringing in now, we allow for the opportunity for compliance first. We're not the type to really kind of come down hard right off the bat. If a non-compliance happens, and it's a continuing issue, then that's something that we'll address at the time, and enforcement measures will be appropriate to the level of non-compliance. But in the meantime, we're still very keen on generating voluntary compliance first. So that's my answer.
Thanks, Jason. Maybe I'll just follow up with a second question to that. If somebody witnesses non-compliance, can they contact CFIA and report it, or report concerns of non-compliance?
Yeah, we do take reports of non-compliance, and we take them very seriously. They're recorded, and we do always follow up. That being said, enforcement can be tricky if we're not the ones observing the non-compliance. So it's very much appreciated when we do get reports, because that kind of helps point us in the right direction. It kind of helps us focus outreach and educational efforts, and it helps us kind of look a little harder at places maybe we need to be looking. But until we observe that non-compliance, enforcement is very difficult. Great, but yes, please report beetles, report non-compliance. Tell tell us everything you see. We're happy to receive it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jason. I don't see any other questions in the chat. If anybody wants to raise a hand and ask a question, I think I'll ask one more question, Jason. And I think Thomas may have briefly mentioned this, but I want to confirm that, CFIA staff, and we also have Invasive Species Council staff available for retailers to come visit the retail site and kind of discuss and chat with their staff about the options for retailers, do maybe a bit of training. Is that a resource that's available to retailers? Oh, you're muted, Jason.
Sorry. Yeah, we always appreciate the opportunity to do outreach. And we do work very closely with the Invasive Species Council. They help us out a lot with that. But, if it's like Thomas was saying, part of those options is having an inspection, having an inspector come and look at your site and stuff like that. We do site assessments for removal of soil, all kinds of things. So I suppose I would echo what Thomas said in his part of the presentation, in that we're very willing to work with specific cases, niche needs, and individual needs, case by case. These regulations are pretty broad. They're not going to be a perfect fit every time. So we do take that into consideration. And we love doing outreach. We love doing presentations. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Jason. I don't see any other questions. I saw someone was typing, but haven't seen anything come through. So perhaps we'll end on that note. And again, anyone's welcome to reach out to staff here at BCLNA or go direct to CFIA with questions or concerns about the program or the options for retailers. So I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending today's session. Thank you to our speakers for all of the great and in-depth information. There was a ton of information in this presentation. This will be posted on our YouTube channel with a shareable link that we will be promoting in our channels. So yes, please connect with us if you have questions, and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.